Okay, so we are going to begin this morning by talking a little bit about the context in which street outreach exists in a homelessness response system. So we're going to begin first by just defining what we mean by homeless response system. If you could go to the next slide, Jenna. So you've perhaps heard this term, and essentially what it means is all of the different entities, institutions, partners who are working together to help people who are experiencing homelessness to exit quickly back into permanent housing. That is the goal of the homeless response system, right? The purpose is to be able to find those people who are in crisis, to prevent homelessness for them whenever possible, and then when it isn't, right, to connect them to housing and services to be able to exit homelessness quickly. Sometimes you might hear the homeless response system referred to as the homeless crisis response system. Again, really trying to get at the fact that homelessness is a crisis, right? It's an urgent matter in a person's life, and it should be treated as such. We don't want to see people languishing in this experience, though I know for a variety of reasons, it's not often something that folks are able to exit quickly, right? But the homelessness response system, again, is comprised of your continuum of care. So all of those different organizations that are committed to working together to address homelessness. It's also inclusive of other partners whose primary goal might not be related to homelessness, but who do interact with people experiencing homelessness regularly. So whether that is healthcare systems, education partners, local law enforcement. The homeless response system is often, we're thinking about kind of the bigger picture, right? All of the different people who these folks are interacting with in the day-to-day. And it's important that we are thinking about all of these different partners because it's really essential for everybody to be working together in order to make progress toward your community's goals around preventing and ending homelessness. So if you could go to the next slide, Jenna, what do folks think is the role of street outreach in Rhode Island's homelessness response system, right? If we're thinking about Rhode Island, not just the continuum of care, but all of those other partners who are really participating in the work to prevent and end homelessness, right? Kind of this big system. How would you define street outreach within that? What is the role of street outreach?
And this isn't a trick question. There's multiple roles, so.
Yes, there are. And folks can use the chat if you want to throw your answers there. No pressure to come off mute. Right, but like I said, homelessness response systems do lots of different things. They identify people, they try to prevent homelessness when possible, they reconnect folks to housing. Where do you see street outreach in that continuum? How would folks define the role? Oh, we got an answer from Ashley here. Street outreach is often the first and sometimes the only connection unsheltered individuals have to services. It brings services to people rather than expecting them to come in. Beautiful response. Thank you, Ashley. Anybody else want to add anything to the role of street outreach in the homeless response system? Yes, Lily added, people get lost in the system and outreaching helps to re-engage them. Absolutely. Connecting folks to local resources, provide supplies, and meet basic needs. Yes, Hannah. Boring macro answer. Outreach provides real-time knowledge of what's happening on the ground, changes in encampments, emerging health issues, or unsafe conditions to inform system planning and resource allocation. Ashley, I remember you from the emergency shelter training, and we should have had you right up here with us today. I feel like you saw the slides ahead of time. Not a boring answer. Okay, these are all really great answers. I think each of you got at the different pieces that we are also going to talk through. So this is awesome. If you could go to the next slide, Jenna. So within a homelessness response system, right, and in the continuum of care in Rhode Island, there are some common interventions that we think of when we think of the homelessness resources specifically. And we kind of think of them in a continuum or a flow, even though folks may use different pieces or move through that flow in different ways. But street outreach, as one of you mentioned, is often one of the first interventions that someone who's experiencing unsheltered homelessness might come into contact with, right? So we think of street outreach at that front door or as an access point to the variety of other resources that may be available in your homeless response system. Along that sort of continuum of services or that sort of flow through the system, in addition to what's at the front door, we also have services geared toward trying to prevent homelessness for people or to resolve it as quickly as possible, reducing the chances or the likelihood that they'll need crisis housing or emergency shelter services. So things like diversion or housing problem solving, or sometimes more upstream prevention. We also have crisis housing supports for those folks whose homelessness can't be resolved quickly. So things like emergency shelter, hotel, motel vouchers, transitional housing, et cetera. And then when folks are exiting the system, it's typically to permanent housing placements that might include things like rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, affordable housing through your local housing authorities, and other options that might exist in the community. So these are some of the common interventions that we think of. And while street outreach typically exists again at that front door, we also often see that street outreach is remaining connected with folks through their entire experience of homelessness. Because again, as one of you mentioned, it's sometimes the only connection point for people who are sleeping outside or in unsheltered places. So you may, street outreach is often one of the first identification points for someone and remaining connected with folks through to the point where they're exiting homelessness into housing, which just, I think, really emphasizes how critical the service is for people who are staying outside. Next slide, Jenna. So as you all already really beautifully defined, the role of street outreach within the homelessness response system is to provide those essential services to people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So sleeping on the street, in cars, in abandoned buildings, in places, as HUD would define it, not meant for human habitation. In connecting those folks with crisis housing, if they are, interested and willing to accept it, with permanent housing ultimately, right, to exit homelessness, and other critical services to meet their basic needs. So whether that's related to health or hygiene or food, or, pet care, I think there's probably a whole slew of really basic and urgent needs that street outreach workers, many of you, are typically helping folks to address. A lot of times those services are life-saving for people. And like we've talked about, street outreach staff are sometimes the only touch point that a person experiencing unsheltered homelessness has to the homeless response system. So that's critical for everything from, first and foremost, meeting that person's basic and urgent needs, but also for the system's data collection and understanding of the scope of homelessness, for the system's ability to help connect that person to housing. Street outreach really just plays such an essential role in that connection, because you all hold those relationships with people. Next slide. So this is a little redundant because we've talked about much of it already, but just to give folks a sense, for those of you who are not street outreach staff here with us, of some of the key components of street outreach, things like addressing those urgent health and safety needs of people who are sleeping outside. So again, whether that's access to crisis housing because they want to come in, or whether it's meeting some of their other needs related to health or safety. Oftentimes in lots of systems, we see street outreach acting as an access point to coordinated entry systems. So coordinated entry being the way that people get connected to the housing resources that are targeted to people experiencing homelessness in your system. This might look like street outreach staff doing coordinated entry assessments or helping people get to places where they can be assessed for housing resources. So again, really that connection point to everything that's available to folks. Street outreach often operate using some of the evidence-based principles that we know are so critical to this work: harm reduction, housing first, trauma-informed care. And really, all of that is rooted in the really strong trust and rapport that street outreach staff typically have with folks who nobody else in the system is interacting with. Next slide. So I think, you all could probably tell us quite a bit about why street outreach is so essential in Rhode Island. But we wanted to reflect that back to you as well. And what we know right now from your data is that folks who are sleeping unsheltered make up about 20% of the whole population of people experiencing homelessness in the state. And you saw a huge increase in the numbers of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in the last couple of years. So this just further highlights why street outreach is so important, because again, street outreach is typically the connection point to these folks who are staying unsheltered. And when we're thinking about the homelessness response system, what we know is that the biggest impact is made, or the most progress is made, when people are working together in a coordinated way. So rather than lots of different agencies kind of operating in silos with their own goals and doing their own thing, when a system and all of its partners can come together and work toward shared goals in a coordinated fashion, we find that work is not being duplicated, that folks aren't getting lost in the system. That coordination really helps to move the needle. And so when we see in a system that unsheltered homelessness is rising, or any other sort of trend like that, we see a great opportunity for folks to work together with a systems approach to address that need. And so street outreach in a system can be really critical partners in that sort of coordinated community response. That might look like, addressing a particular encampment that has, been established and maybe is posing challenges in the community. Working to coordinate triage and assessment efforts. So, if there are folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness who aren't being captured in the coordinated entry system and therefore aren't getting access to housing resources, doing some work to ensure that they are connected with. Data sharing, right? Making sure who's out there, and also supporting connections to housing. So I think a lot of times street outreach, out of all of the different interventions in a homelessness response system, typically operates kind of on its own, because it is this super unique role, right? That is so grounded in relationship building with folks. And sometimes that ends up looking like people kind of operating in silos, because you're frequently addressing people's really urgent needs out in the community, right, rather than in a site-based model. And so I think sometimes it requires the system, right, leadership, working with street outreach teams to bring folks into the fold, to help include them in the planning around homeless response system efforts, because again, street outreach workers are such critical partners in that work. Next slide.
I think I heard maybe a couple people come off mute. Did anyone want to share reflections on this or have questions, comments? Okay, just making sure.
So these are some examples of the ways that a street outreach team might be responsive to the changing needs of a community in a system-wide effort to end homelessness. So for example, in a community where perhaps they were having difficulty finding people who are being prioritized for housing, including street outreach teams regularly in case conferencing conversations or matching conversations to make sure that those folks are able to be identified, again, because the street outreach folks have those connections in the community. Could be one way that street outreach is participating in that system-wide response. I'm going to share an example in just a moment of this one in particular, but another way that we might see street outreach teams really participating in that system-wide response could be addressing large encampments that perhaps become established over time. So if that were taking place, street outreach could be brought in to coordinate with a broad variety of partners to carry out a more organized and targeted approach to that encampment resolution. And then lastly, if a community, for example, figured out that the majority of folks staying unsheltered were not assessed for coordinated entry, right? They had no connection to the prioritization list for access to resources. Street outreach could be really critical partners in that effort to make sure that everybody who's unsheltered is assessed for housing resources. So again, just to give you a sense of how street outreach, this is its role, right? Everything that you all just described, but it's really such a crucial part of that larger system and really important partners in the system-wide work to prevent and end homelessness in any community. And I'm going to share an example with you from Boston. I think if you were in our our emergency shelter training, we shared a Boston example there too. But if you could go to the next slide, Jenna. Folks may have heard in the news over the last couple of years, there was quite a large encampment that developed in Boston near the intersections of Melnia Cass and Mass Ave. People referred to it as Mass and Cass, which is the term that perhaps you heard in the news or read about if you're familiar with it. But this was a really large encampment that over time started to become a pretty dangerous place, not just for homeless response system staff, street outreach workers, but also for the folks who were staying there. There were multiple instances of violence over the period of time that this encampment existed. And so there was, as you could imagine, some pushback from the local community around this encampment. And in addition to the safety concerns, ultimately the city decided that they needed to come up with a plan to resolve this encampment. And so from the very beginning of this planning, the city understood that street outreach were essential partners in planning to resolve this encampment. They knew that if street outreach were not involved from the very beginning, it would not be a successful effort. So city leadership partnered with lots of different entities who were going to be critical to the work, but street outreach were really at the center of it. So they were both, part of that planning as well as the implementation of the encampment resolution alongside city leadership from the mayor's office, law enforcement, public works. They all really needed to work together to figure out what to do. And the reason why outreach was so important is because they held the relationships with the people staying in this encampment. Nobody else in the system had that trust and rapport with the folks who were sleeping at Mass and Cass, right? And so the city had no idea what would incentivize people to want to, take a low barrier shelter bed or to move into a hotel or motel or to accept a permanent housing placement. They did not know these people, and therefore they did not know what they were looking for, what they needed. And so the fact that street outreach could be at the table in that planning was huge because they could tell the city, what would work, what folks were looking for, what was really going to be needed in order to incentivize them to move on from this particular area. So the city provided the street outreach staff with training and resources to ensure that they all were on the same page around communication. There were some really neat things that were provided, like a web page was set up with real-time access to resources and contacts. All of the different street outreach teams were sort of mapped out so they understood who was where when and responsible for what. So they were able to coordinate with one another. Again, typically working in silos, but able to kind of ensure that folks weren't duplicating efforts. And that communication was really important because they needed to be able to have the same messaging with people around, here's now how much time you have until the encampment is closing. Here's what the options are. Have you thought about this, etc. Another thing that the city realized was that they didn't have data on most of the people who were sleeping there. So street outreach were essential in being able to figure out who is actually staying in this encampment, right? It became such a busy area that there were folks in and out all day who weren't necessarily actually sleeping there at night. And so through those street outreach relationships, the city was able to discern who's actually staying unsheltered, who's just coming here to hang out and doesn't really need to be considered for a housing resource because they have housing. Um, and so that was another really critical role they played. Um, Ultimately, they were set up to lead these mini teams during the encampment resolution process where they were going in to talk to folks alongside a housing navigator who really had that extensive knowledge of housing options, a mental health case manager who could help address folks' mental health needs in real time, get them connected to resources. So, small groups of 3 to 5 staff. And they were able to use their strong relationships with people to introduce these other folks who could help, essentially figure out what the best option was for the people that they were interacting with. Again, whether that was taking a low barrier shelter bed, maybe moving into sober housing, maybe there was a permanent housing option for them to go to. Um, and then they were also, it wasn't like street outreach had these great relationships, the encampment was closed, and then they never talked to anybody again. They were able to stay connected. So that was, I think, a really essential piece too, is that typically, street outreach support ends when somebody goes inside, right? And that's when other case management might step in, but they were able to provide follow-up after the encampment closure to ensure that folks had what they needed and that they were situated wherever they had essentially gone to. So we've got an example of the resolution process here as well, kind of mapped out in a timeline, but it was over the course of several weeks. And what we really want to drive home here is just how important street outreach partners can be working alongside homeless response system leadership to address these system-wide goals. And this encampment closure was a really successful example of that. And I see a question in the chat. Did the right to shelter policy play a role in how the closure was handled, especially in terms of who could be offered placement and how that was communicated? So Jenna, I see you just came off mute. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that question as you were, or not that, just the concept of how emergency shelter played a role in this as well. And one thing I'll say is, like, before this strategy even started being developed, street outreach teams were had a plan and executed this plan of, like, really talking to people and understanding why they weren't coming inside. Because so for those of you who don't know, Boston has a right to shelter. There is a city funded, not solely city funded, but there is a city shelter. And the idea is that anyone who wants to come inside is able to come inside, will have a place to come inside. So it was a situation where, people were so-called choosing to stay outside. So there was a lot of information gathering through the street outreach teams to understand why people weren't coming inside. And that led to a lot of work to lower barriers to shelter in Boston. We are actually going to do a whole session on that I think it's next Wednesday, actually, on the 11th, about effective practices for low barrier shelter. Just quickly, it's things like offering storage, kind of looser policies while still ensuring safety, but policies that allow people who are actively using substances to still be able to come inside, maybe come and go, not as strict policies around when you have to be inside, when you have to leave, and how to make those types of shifts work. But yeah, that was definitely part of the conversation, and the street outreach teams and the shelters had to work really closely to figure out how to make that happen and all work together for the folks who did want to come inside. Any other questions? Okay. If we have time, Ellen, can I pose a question?
Please, yeah, I think we do.
Because even ahead of that training, but also because I think it's a good thing to be thinking about when you're considering this next piece of this training, which is housing focused practices in street outreach, and oftentimes what engagement looks like for that. Based on your conversations, not necessarily like what you're guessing or what you might assume, just knowing the system, but based on your conversations with people, for those of you who are in street outreach roles, why do you think people are not coming inside? Is it more that they want to come inside, they don't have a physical bed to go into, there's not enough capacity in the system? Do you hear other barriers like pets, storage, I'm using, actively using, and it's just not a space I could use? What would you say are some of the responses that you might hear from someone based on your conversations? Feel free to come off mute.
I would say definitely pets. I know there was a woman living outside for a long time under a bridge in extreme cold weather. And so cold, I just couldn't even imagine how she did it. But she did it because her cats weren't going to be allowed to go in, and that was just unacceptable to her.
Mhm.
And I mean, we all love our pets, so we can kind of relate to that.
Yeah, totally.
I see some answers in the chat too, Jenna. Lack of space, not wanting to deal with shelter rules, not feeling safe in shelter, a
Yeah.
lot of pets, storage, and lack of beds available, having to share space with other people, shelter
Yep.
policies like early vacate, the lack of freedom, shelter itself being a barrier in the system. Sorry, I think I might have interrupted someone else who came off mute. Please go ahead.
I think somebody already answered it in the chat. I was going to say the fear of like following rules at the shelter.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's something that we actually experience at the women's shelter. Most people don't really want to follow the rules, so sometimes they would just leave on their own, or they would not want to come back.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all really helpful when we're thinking about what to highlight in this next training here, but also be thinking about that as well when you're having housing conversations, because that can really play a role in kind of that shift towards housing as well. So we'll talk more about that, but thank you. Okay, and speaking of that, we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about housing-focused street outreach. And just want to check in with people. How we doing? Anyone need a break? Feel free to take a moment if you need to at any time. I think we're doing pretty good on time. So if people needed a 5-minute break, we could take one. Would that be helpful? You could do the thumbs up emoji. Okay, I think we'll just move forward then. Oh, I should preface because I'm about to do this piece of the session. I've been having really bad allergies, and Ellen has been on multiple calls with me this week where I just will have to turn off my camera randomly and walk away so I can have a coughing attack. If that happens, Ellen will jump in, but just wanted to give people a heads up that that will most likely have to happen, unfortunately. I don't know about you, but these allergies are really getting to me this year. Okay, so what is housing-focused street outreach? It really is the idea that Ellen has reiterated with the systems approach as well, that unsheltered households journey back to housing. And you all mentioned this, but street outreach plays a really critical role in supporting that journey back to housing, because of the role they play in helping identify people, assessing them for housing connections, actually helping them make that connection to services. One of the examples that Ellen had given in the systems approach is being so critical that when a housing opportunity does come up, street outreach case managers, street outreach workers are often the folks that other people in the system, housing providers can go to rely on helping actually make that physical contact with folks when a housing opportunity happens. And sometimes we hear about people missing out on a housing opportunity because their mail was not delivered to they've moved locations and their mail was delivered elsewhere, for example, or because they didn't have any regular contact with someone in the homeless response system. So again, just reiterating how important street outreach is to that housing journey. When we're talking about housing-focused street outreach, we're talking about a street outreach approach that not only focuses on meeting the basic needs of folks, but also integrating rehousing practices into all aspects of their engagement with households that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So what does that look like? If you were in the emergency shelter training, this is an activity that you have seen before, but we do think it's important for folks who were not there. So we are going to take some time to do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy and do a quick activity. So I think many of you have probably heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's often talked about in our field. But Maslow was a psychologist who found that to meet our full potential, or what he calls self-actualization, any human, we need to meet our most basic needs first. And when we say most basic needs, we're talking about the biological, physiological, and safety needs that we all have. So without those basic needs met, we stay in that survival mode and cannot kind of move up this pyramid as readily. So Maslow's includes this whole pyramid. I mentioned the basic needs. Then there's the psychological needs, which is speaking more to the need of feeling loved and feeling belonging within a community. That could be your family unit. It could be other support systems. It could be your community at large, just kind of whatever community you find yourself in, having a sense of love and belonging. Then there's esteem, so that could be self-esteem, the respect that you feel, your status, feeling of strength and kind of capability. And then there's this self-actualization, which is a self-fulfillment need. And really that's the sense of purpose, that you are fulfilling your potential in life. And that looks different for every person. So a lot of times we also talk about like success looks different for everyone. This is that same sentiment, that your sense of success is going to look really different than someone else's. But in order to get to that place of success, self-actualization, these other kind of basic needs are critical to meet. Okay. So what do we think about housing and that? We're going to do about 5 minutes in breakout rooms. They're going to be small breakout rooms, and I'm going to pull up a whiteboard. I haven't used whiteboard as recently, so I'm not sure if you're going to be able to get into the whiteboard from the breakout rooms, but I'll pull up the whiteboard in a moment so you know what it looks like. But essentially in your breakout room, you're going to choose one of these categories and talk about why you think housing fits in that category. So you're going to pick one, talk about how housing fits in there. And when you come back, we're going to ask one person from each group to share. So just make sure before you come back that you decide who is going to share. And I'm going to pull up this whiteboard because we're going to use the whiteboard function. And for those of you who have not used whiteboard before, it's super easy, and we can type on it for you for those who haven't used it before. Okay, so hopefully you can see this whiteboard. Ellen, can you see it? Okay,
Yes,
lovely. So you can see we have Maslow's hierarchy on here, and then we have some sticky notes already on this board. I'm moving one of them around so you can see it. And essentially what we want you to do is, as a group, choose one of the areas. You're gonna pick a sticky note, double click it, and then you can type in it and put it wherever on the pyramid that you think it fits into. If you start trying to use the whiteboard and you're not getting it, totally fine. When we do our share out, we will just type into a sticky note for you and place it on the pyramid. It just can be really cool to see at the end where folks put housing. Any questions before we open the breakout room?
Will you be timing the breakout room and ending it yourself, or how we doing
Yeah,
that?
we will end it. We'll give you a heads up, and we will end it. And apologies if we cut off any conversations, but we will give you about 5 minutes or so. And take a minute to introduce yourselves to others, because I think many of you are from the same organization, but not all of you. So, yeah, any good question. Any other questions? Will each breakout room be assigned a hierarchy of need? No, you get to choose which hierarchy of need that you think housing fits into. So you all can decide that as a group. Okay, let's open those breakout rooms. And we will give you all a few minutes.
You should see it pop up on your screen to allow you to join the room that you've been randomly assigned to. But if you don't see it popping up on your screen, breakout rooms should be an option in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and that should allow you to join the room.
Did you launch the room, Ellen?
I put it back.
There we go. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I thought I had.
Okay, so that notification should have popped up. I see
Yeah.
some of you are getting pulled in there. Just let us know if you have any issues because we can move you to the room. Okay. Okay. So, we're just gonna go. Ellen, can you remind me how many teams there were?
There were 5.
There were 5. Okay, so we're gonna go through all the teams and hopefully you chose someone to share out. If you want to go ahead and write on a sticky note, feel free to do that and we'll get around to each team. If you are having trouble using the sticky note, we are happy to write for you when we get to your team. So we are going to give folks a minute to write on the sticky notes if you want to do that and move your sticky note to the area of the pyramid where you'd like to place your housing sticky. So we'll give folks a minute to do that. Oh, someone's getting fancy with like arrows. Nice. Okay, we'll go through each team and Ellen and I can take notes for you. So team 1, and let me pull this up so I know who was on each team. So team 1 was Izzy, Rosa, Tatiana.
So we ran into a bit of an issue that we couldn't really use the whiteboard. So like Tatiana, Rosa, Ellen, and I, we had a conversation
Nice.
as to what we thought which would be more beneficial. And Tatiana, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we did say that housing does belong into each of these categories. I personally share that for the sense of love and belonging is more crucial just because it creates a sense of community, and that's why we see a lot of homeless encampments being lifted in several areas of the city, especially in Providence, from what I've seen and experienced while I used to work for the mayor's office.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes, absolutely. Love and belonging. It's a space where you can build community where you meet up with your community. And I think that's really important. So I love that you said that. Sorry, we have some people in the waiting room as well. Okay. Team 2 was Claudia, Lily, another Rosa, Wendy.
Jenna, I'm gonna be very transparent. We really didn't have that much interaction. Me and Claudia worked together. Lily, I wasn't able to conversate with her. Maybe she was just busy in the background.
Sure.
But we were kind of confused on what the question was. But just to describe a little bit, me and Claudia work for One Neighborhood Builders. We do a lot of the prevention and eviction work, a lot with health, finances, budgeting, and housing stability. So
Nice. So you sound like you're kind of a housing provider. Why do you think, like, do you see housing being really important to one or more of these kind of categories here in Maslow's hierarchy?
I would say under safety, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
when people have homes, and they just have a sense of safety amongst themselves. Be able to, have a lot of their things together.
Mm-hmm.
That's about it that I can share. I don't know if Claudia wants to share a little bit more, or Lily.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Say there's this privacy that comes with housing, safety from the outer world and whatever is happening in that outer world, safety from people coming to you. There's so much that comes with housing as far as safety goes. So I think that's really important to highlight. Oh, sure. Claudia?
Yeah, yes, I want to say something. Also, is a compassion and love
Mm-hmm.
and respect and no judgments,
Mm-hmm.
because our work with the team, the COC, we have someone is more easy to do work with, the other one is more heavy, I will say.
Mm-hmm.
But we are doing a great job because they had been changed their life little by little.
Yeah.
Then we can see the challenges that they also create in their life. Then I think also always I believe with love and respect, everything work better for others.
Yeah, I love that. And that makes me think of that esteem one where there's like this mutual respect and almost like this feeling of accomplishment that comes with getting housing back. Yeah. Okay. Room 4 was Ashley and Ryan. Either of you want to come off mute?
I can.
Sure.
Miguel was with us too, I believe.
Okay, cool.
We had a good conversation. We did discuss how housing does fit in all the categories, but we decided to mostly focus on how it's central to love and belonging. Because when someone loses housing, they just don't lose a roof. They lose the ability to maintain relationships, stay connected to family, host friends, and even just keep their pets. And they lose their place in the community. I mean, people just aren't unhoused. They're often unbelonged. That's why shelter alone often isn't just enough. We need housing that restores people's dignity, identity, and relationships.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. So essential. Anything else from that group? Okay, and room 5, our last room here, Hannah, Kimberly, and Stacy.
We also couldn't see the whiteboard, so I was reading the hierarchy, trying to focus in on what the all choices were and then what was the question again. So, but we settled on biological and physiological needs just because without those, they do build up everything else. We're talking about the woman that was on the street and, under sub-zero temperatures, she might disappear and go somewhere, but she'd be back. And it's like, how did she survive that? She must have gotten, food, water, stuff she needed to make her able to stay out in those extreme conditions.
Yeah. So as you can see, different teams put housing in different categories. And I think one thing that multiple of you have said is that housing does really belong in all of these categories, which is absolutely right. So we're going to switch back over to our PowerPoint here. So just give me 1 second. And as I'm getting that up, any last thoughts before we move on from the activity? Okay. So just to reiterate some of the points that you all brought up as we were doing this activity, like I said, housing really does belong in all of these categories here in the hierarchy of needs. So many of you pointed out the importance of the biological and physiological and safety. Oh, Ellen, it looks like we have some people in the waiting room too. Okay. So not only a safe place to sleep, but what always really stuck with me was this like predictability about the place that you're going to sleep. So it wasn't like at risk at any given time. It wasn't something that you had to seek out on the day-to-day basis. You weren't wondering where you were going to sleep. And I think that takes up so much space for people experiencing homelessness sometimes. So also that predictability aspect of your home being there is really important to that building that biological and physiological, meeting that need. Safety, like I mentioned, from the outside world, even things like the locks or alarms or sound structure. I even think about sometimes I get a little spooked when I'm home alone. I have a partner that I live with and they're on a work trip right now and I'm home alone. And I thought about this last night when I was thinking through this training, but even the idea that like if someone opened the door to my house, you can tell I have like anxiety a little bit, but when someone opens the door to my house, I can hear that and that signals to me. And so there is this like this physical structure keeping me from the outside world and how important that is for some people. The sense of love and belonging, which multiple groups talked about, but it is a place to spend time with loved ones. It's a place where you can build relationships. And someone mentioned this, I'm sorry, I didn't catch who from one of the groups, but there is a sense of community that comes with some of these encampments that folks are staying in. And we don't want to discount that sense of community by saying you can only get that with a home. It looks different in a home, right? There's some, like I mentioned, predictability to it. There's different types of activities you do to spend with others. It's a place where someone can find you, which is also important. A place for reunification. And someone mentioned pets. I love that. It's like a place where your pet can live as well. And then esteem, having a home can improve self-esteem, that sense of accomplishment. Clean, organized, welcoming home can gain respect from others. That is kind of the reality of our culture here. And then self-actualization, helping us move to our full potential where we have a space to make decisions for calmness. Not that every home is calm, but it is a different space than living in an unsheltered situation. Any other thoughts here before we move on? Okay. So if homes and a place to call home, a house is a way of helping us meet these different needs and ultimately reach that place of self-actualization, you have probably thought about and you can imagine, and maybe you have even had this experience yourself, but what it means to lose that basic human need and how it impacts all of the other needs that we talked through with Maslow's hierarchy. So when any of us lose that human basic need to survive, it becomes a stressful and traumatic experience. And we're going to talk about what that type of stress and trauma does to your ability to make decisions and think through and problem solve. It's not necessarily the answer to all types of behavior or situations having a home, but it does provide a stark contrast of what your brain functioning looks like when you're in that constant state of stress. So like I said, hard to solve problems. It's really hard to change behavior or shift behavior. Things like following through with plans can be particularly difficult. Impulsive behaviors and emotions tend to play more of a role. And then remembering and retrieving important information and communicating can also be challenging. That is because when we're in states of stress, we're actually using a different part of our brain. So you can see on this left side here, Ellen, I need to cough.
No problem at all. So you can see on the left side. Oh,
I think I'm okay.
very good. Okay.
Okay, so on this left side of the brain here, you see this is what more kind of normal cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses look like. So you can see this blue part here, that's the prefrontal cortex. And that is where we make decisions, problem solve. It's called our executive functioning piece of our brain. That is typically what is in charge of your brain when you're more in like stable, calm environment. You're not in that place of like stress overload. When we get into that place of stress, our brain, prefrontal cortex in our brain weakens. And so that takes less control. And what overrides that is these red parts of our brain. So that's the basal ganglia and the amygdala. And those are parts of our brain that really focus on, sorry, I thought I was going to cough. Okay. Those are the parts of our brain that are more of that emotional, impulsive side of our brain. And so when you think about like fight, flight, that's the part of the brain that takes over the prefrontal cortex. And so you can imagine this executive functioning piece, and that's lessening. And then this more impulsive emotional response is taking over. Sometimes that is really intense. You may have had an experience where something really intense happened and it was a lot of stress, and it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's even a good thing, but your kind of like reactive behavior takes charge and it's that fight or flight thing. You may have had an experience where you like kind of even like sometimes people will say like, I blacked out. I don't even know what I said. I don't know what I did. Maybe you were like terrified of public speaking when you were younger and you did a presentation, and then afterwards you were like, I have no idea what I said. That is kind of that part of your brain. Ellen raised her hand. Funny, Ellen, you chose a profession that where you're constantly public speaking. So that is an example of where that prefrontal cortex is lessening and those kind of survival mode techniques are coming into play. Like a really obvious example that people use is like if a large animal is like charging towards you, you're not really using this prefrontal cortex of your brain, which would be like, I wonder how fast that animal is going, or should I climb this tree, or would it be best to run away? You're not taking the time to really think through those types of behaviors and then making a decision. You're going into a mode that in whatever mode is going to protect you at that point in time. And I think that protection piece is really key. So it's not to say that people are like constantly in this like high state of stress and like constantly in fight and flight. We as humans like move through a state of stress and not stress, or maybe you've heard of like parasympathetic, sympathetic system at any given time throughout the day. But for people who are in more stressful situations and having trouble responding to stress, this part of our brain can be the more active one throughout the day and long periods of time. And that really does impact how you make decisions. And like I said, how you follow through with plans, how you retain information, And really all of this is to give you context about why folks might have a hard time engaging in services. So we'll talk more about that. The other quick thing I want to touch on is this trauma-informed lens. We're not going to go in depth into this trauma-informed approach. I think many of you have probably had training or do training regularly on a trauma-informed approach, but the takeaway we want to mention here is that at a minimum, you can really assume that someone has experienced chronic trauma, because the experience of chronic poverty or homelessness is what we would consider a chronic trauma, which is this like repeated or prolonged experience. And it's this idea of like being in that kind of fight or flight mode for longer periods of time, or more frequently than maybe someone who is experiencing housing stability. Another takeaway here is that it's not necessarily the street outreach person's role to dig into someone's trauma. You might be a clinician. You're probably not, you're not a street outreach team that like requires everyone to be a clinician. That's not very common. And we aren't necessarily looking to diagnose people's trauma. It's more for us to use that lens when we're working with folks to really help understand their behavior and have some understanding about how to move forward with them as well. A big piece of this service engagement is understanding how people are coping with their trauma. So coping mechanisms, you've probably heard of them. You probably know which ones you tend to go towards in your places of stress. But for people who have experienced trauma or prolonged stress, in order to survive and live with that traumatic experience or that fear, that anxiety, we develop coping mechanisms to protect ourselves and to help us continue living through those situations. So that could look like trouble paying attention, someone's tuning out, trouble maintaining safe relationships. So you can probably think of folks who go into every relationship that they have with kind of this baseline of mistrust. And I'm not saying that's for no reason at all. Usually they have very good reason to go into relationships with mistrust. So just kind of understanding that lens when you're working with someone. Withdrawn, connecting, see that a lot. Use of substances or other escapes. Maybe decisions are made based on fear. So a good example of that is not wanting housing due to fear of returning to homelessness. And that might not even be something that they're specifically vocalizing or have made the connection on. It is their coping mechanism taking over and protecting them from another traumatic experience. And sometimes that's why we see that freezing or inaction to make decisions, because less risk or more feeling of safety in the moment they're in now. So what does that mean for service engagement? It can be tricky for people to pursue or maintain a job if they do get a job, independently apply for benefits. There are so many steps that go into that. And so you can imagine and probably work with folks who have a lot of trouble following through on those steps, or kind of breaking down. Again, that's that executive functioning piece of your brain that problem solves all of that, that can really process those different steps and go through them. Following a budget, controlling discretionary spending, all of those can be particularly difficult for people who are really relying on their coping mechanisms in response to trauma. This also highlights the importance of low barrier admissions. And again, we're going to talk about that next week, what low barrier shelter can look like, but also the housing programs that are serving people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. It's so important to have really low barrier. And I think some of you are housing providers. So what that would look like is not necessarily just low eligibility, but also the steps someone has to take in your intake process, and what timelines you're expecting people to make those steps. So for example, your eligibility might be, oh, they just have to do this homelessness verification, but then you're also asking people to have their birth certificate, have an ID, to fill out, you know, a 5-page packet with someone in order to do the intake. All of that is a lot of steps in the process at a very overwhelming time, and at a time where coping mechanisms tend to kick in because something new, it's a change for someone. That's when our coping mechanisms try to protect us. And so it can be really tricky to take all of those steps to enroll in a program. So really think about maybe that enrollment intake process a little bit differently if you are asking for all of those steps up front. I'm just going to touch on this, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time on more specific housing practices. This probably isn't new for many people, but it is a helpful model or framework when you're thinking about engaging people in housing conversations. So this is the stages of change framework where we think about working towards a change in behavior. It's more used in the health field, but many people in the homelessness field have found it really helpful in thinking about how your engagement goes. So if you think about a household you're working with, an individual you're working with, thinking about which stage they're in can shift to what you talk about with them when you talk about it. So for example, someone in this pre-contemplation stage that has no intention on changing behavior, you're not talking about housing. You're probably just building a relationship with them, building some trust, helping them feel safe in their relationship with you. For someone who's in contemplation or maybe even preparation, maybe you're starting to have housing conversations, starting to like help them have a vision of what that might look like, because they're aware they might want to go into housing, or maybe they're changing a behavior that would help them get into housing, but they're not quite taking action on that yet. Housing in action and maintenance, those types of conversations would be more proactive and productive. So you would actually be taking steps together towards that housing. And this is not to say that this is linear or cyclical. It's actually quite the opposite. People can move through these different stages, especially if something happens in their life. But just it's a really good tuning in exercise when you're about to meet with someone, like really thinking about like what stage are they in and what is my housing conversation or lack of housing conversation going to look like because of that. Okay, so you have this really great foundation of what engagement, what frameworks and theories and lenses you should be taking in your engagement. So we're going to talk more specifically about what are those housing focused approaches look like in your engagement.
So I'm curious, for those folks who are street outreach staff on the call, we have talked at length, right, about how so much of the role of street outreach is meeting folks' basic and urgent needs, right? That's probably the bulk of what you're doing in the day-to-day. But how often are you having housing conversations with the folks that you have relationships with out in the community? Pretty often, not very often, because you're really focused on addressing all these other things. Feel free to throw it in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, you're welcome to. But is housing something that you're talking about frequently, or are you really focused on some of the other pieces that tend to be, you know, more urgent in the moment? I see it frequently. I know there's at least a few of you who do street outreach on the call. If you're not, that's okay, and pretty common having not having housing conversations. And I think that's something that we see really often. Again, I mentioned earlier how street outreach in most systems, most homeless response systems, tends to kind of operate in its own little bubble because you all are working with right folks who are not staying in a particular place. They're out in the community, in encampments, in all of these various places. You're meeting them where they're at, and you're typically addressing those really critical and urgent needs. And so that very understandably is what takes up the bulk of your role. And it should, right? Because you are people's connection to the resources that they need to stay safe and alive in many cases. That said, you are also in this really unique position where you have that trust and rapport with people. You're typically, again, their only connection to the homeless response system. And so you have this unique opportunity to weave housing into your conversations to help open the door and plant the seed for people to think about whether or when they might be ready to accept an emergency shelter or crisis housing placement or permanent housing placement once an offer is made to them. And I see, Hannah, thank you for sharing that housing is often brought up, but not always entertained. And that is so common, again, what we see, because yeah, I need housing, but also I need to eat today. And so let's think about that. Or I need a bus pass to get to this place, right? And so what we're going to think about are the ways that street outreach workers can be supported to incorporate more of those housing conversations in the everyday engagement that you're having with people. Again, just because you do have those relationships and can play such a critical role in the connection to those permanent housing placements. Next slide. So we're going to talk through some different strategies and then hopefully engage in conversation with all of you around whether this is something you feel like you have the resources for, or if there are things that you need in order to be able to do this. We can talk through what that might look like as well. So one of the first things that we find to be most helpful for street outreach folks to engage in housing-focused conversations is to really understand the landscape of housing and what's available. So often, which is a really wonderful thing, we now have really focused housing staff in our homeless response system, sometimes called housing navigators or housing advocates. And these folks are typically the people who know everything there is to know about what housing resources exist and how to do the applications and all of the, in the weeds stuff that's really important. And we're not expecting that street outreach folks will be able to hold all of that as well. But having a basic understanding of the housing landscape, having consistency around the language that's used when you're talking about housing interventions can really go a long way. Those of you who were in the emergency shelter training might remember an example that Jenna shared where they discovered that a staff person in the shelter had been telling folks to not accept rapid rehousing and to wait for permanent supportive housing. And that was just because they had a misunderstanding about the types of housing resources that were available and were sharing what they knew, but it happened to be, unfortunately, not what the shelter was trying to promote in connecting folks to housing placements. So really making sure that everybody has a good solid foundation of understanding around what the housing resources are allows for that clear and consistent messaging and can really help to demystify it for people too. When there is that fear around housing or, different housing options, because you're the folks with the relationships, being able to talk about them, to explain what they mean, what they are, address any misconceptions. Again, it can really go a long way when a housing offer is made and somebody's unsure about what it might be. So obviously, we don't have the time to do an in-depth training on all of the different housing resources that exist, but you will get a copy of the slides. And on the next slide here, we have a really high-level overview of the typical types of housing resources that we see in a homeless response system and the ones that we know you do have in Rhode Island. So you probably hear terms like rapid rehousing, where folks have access to time-limited rental assistance and move-in costs, where they find a unit in the community where they are the leaseholder, and they receive assistance, maybe including supportive services for a period of time before they're expected to take over the cost of the lease. Permanent supportive housing is another type of housing in homelessness response systems where people are paying a percentage of their income toward the rent. So it's very affordable. Typically, folks are required to have a disabling condition to be eligible. Both permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing would be accessed through a homeless response system's coordinated entry. Housing choice vouchers or Section 8 vouchers are typically available, or periodically available in homeless response systems through public housing authorities. This is another type of subsidy where people pay a percentage of their income toward the rent to make it very affordable, where they're typically renting a private unit in the community and using that voucher to help make the rent affordable. I should have mentioned permanent supportive housing can also be used like a voucher where someone's identifying a unit in the community, or sometimes it is site-based. So it's a particular unit that where the subsidy is attached to. Which is also what a project-based voucher is, where there are apartments that have a subsidy attached to them. Again, making the rent more affordable, where somebody pays a percentage of their income toward the rent. They can't take that subsidy to move, but they can have the affordable rent while they live in that place. Those, along with Section 8 vouchers, are typically administered by your public housing authority, so not usually accessible through coordinated entry, but still part of that overall system. There is then also public housing, which is typically operated through a public housing authority where they own properties, where people pay a percentage of their income toward the rent. The PHA is essentially the landlord of those properties. Sometimes that's referred to as project housing as well in different communities. And then lastly, there are also subsidized housing opportunities for different populations. So we know there's lots of different, both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing for veterans. There are different types of subsidized housing for people with disabilities, people who are living with HIV or AIDS, for young people, for people fleeing domestic violence and other types of violence. So there's a lot in a system, right? And like I said, there's no expectation that in addition to addressing somebody's basic, and urgent needs, that street outreach staff should know the ins and outs of all of these, but to have a pretty solid baseline of what's in your system, the language that's used, how to talk about it, how it's accessed, can go a long way when you're engaging with folks. And maybe when they're saying, hey, I got a call about this, what do you think? Or do you know what this means? Because you hold those really important relationships. And so we're curious, right now in the current state of Rhode Island's homeless response system, do street outreach folks feel like you have what you need to understand the landscape of housing resources that are available to the people that you're interacting with? If you could go to the next slide, Jenna. Do you feel like, one, you have that information? And if you don't, what do you feel like you're missing right now? And there's no wrong answers. This is meant to help us sort of understand where folks are at and where there might be opportunities for whether it's training or resources or, things that the continuum of care can help with. I see more training would be beneficial on housing opportunities. Totally. How about other folks? Do you know where to go? Like, is there, when you have questions about housing, things that come up with folks, do you know where to go for resources? Where to get your questions answered? Is there anyone here who's doing street outreach who feels like, yeah, I have this foundation. I understand all the housing resources that are available and can talk about them, because maybe you could share how that came to be for you. Ooh, Tatiana, would you be willing to share a little? No pressure to come off mute if you can't or don't want to, but if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit more. It sounds like this is an area where folks would benefit from more information sharing, maybe across providers. That's another thing we haven't really talked about, but really often, right, there's street outreach teams working with different organizations, and maybe there's not a lot of opportunity to connect with each other, to connect with housing providers, with the continuum of care, to get questions answered, to understand what's available. But it sounds like that's an area of opportunity. Info about how to apply for different programs. There's a monthly housing meeting. That's great.
Sorry, this is Rosa. I was having issues with my team, so I with the just Zoom in general, but I put in a link to a rental resource guide that Rhode Island Housing updates frequently, and it essentially lists out all the resources that we for low income public housing authorities. So usually we try to share this with case managers so they can have a guide of where to start. And so yeah, so I just put it there for anybody that hasn't had access to it before. And those are usually housing resources outside of what rehousing and PSH within Rhode Island.
Thanks, Rosa. That's super helpful. And I see some folks in the chat connecting about a monthly housing meeting that could be another helpful resource to work toward having this, baseline knowledge of the housing landscape. And then Ashley shared some reflections here too about how really systems are asking a whole lot of outreach staff, which if we have not conveyed effectively, we are certainly trying to, right? We know that you are holding so much for people. You're that primary connection. You are helping them meet their needs every day. And to have to hold all of this housing knowledge is a lot on top of that. And so, yeah, there are definitely system solutions that communities should be working towards so that whether that's, in a perfect world, housing navigators are paired with street outreach and they're going out together to engage with folks in the community. Maybe it's looking for funding to be able to support that kind of thing. And then also transparency, right? Giving people the information that they need to have the conversations. Anything else that folks want to share? Or Jenna, anything you want to add?
No, just want to totally agree with Ashley. And I think back to the example that Ellen shared about the Mass area of Boston, the interdisciplinary mini teams were so important to that because the street outreach folks were they held the relationship. And so often they get asked to do a lot of these extra things. But they were making the introduction, they were going out together. So yeah, I just the ideas of interdisciplinary teams can be incredibly helpful. So just to reiterate that.
Yeah, I don't know that I said this explicitly, but also back to that example and the second point that you made there, Ashley, about, giving people the map if we are expecting them to navigate the maze. Jenna, you might know more about it, but I understood that the street outreach staff in Boston were given essentially a menu of triage options. So they had this really concrete information that they could share with people about, the encampment is going to be closed on this date. Here are the different options that we can explore. And so there was no mystery or expectation that people were having to hold it all in their head. It was really concretely given to them electronically, right? So they could have it out in the field.
Yeah, and really their role was to introduce the options and to know enough to explain it. But there were other folks who were played the role of really connecting with them to go through the process of that housing option. Okay. Oh, I see some more chat. Let's see. Yes, the briefings, the trainings, that's really important. I think one of the Ellen, I can't remember if we included one of these as the example, but like one systems approach that we see street outreach workers take at times is to be really involved in case conferencing. Even if unsheltered homelessness isn't like as prominent as other types of homelessness in a system, yeah, being part of those regular case conferencing spaces and connecting with housing providers, like really helping people understand the barriers to housing that people who were living in an encampment or outside or in a car were facing, and then connecting with those different housing providers. And even if the main goal of those case conferencing spaces wasn't to share resources or like train people on resources, that is often what happens in those case conferencing spaces. And it's cool to see people just like who maybe have even been working in the same community for like 15 years, like learn a new resource or be a resource to others who are newer in the field. I remember when I worked in a program like that, someone who had been in the field for a long time was like kind of took me under her wing as a mentor, and I learned so many of the ins and outs, things that it would have taken me years to learn. So just having a space to like connect with other people was so important. Okay. Oh, sorry, I just skipped over that. Okay. We have about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to move us along. Housing problem solving conversations. So you have probably heard the term like diversion or housing problem solving. Oh, we also should say like none of these are like silver bullet options for like every person experiencing unsheltered homelessness, right? Like a lot of these things are systems issues, like Ashley's mentioned. So these are some practices that might work for some folks. And it really depends on what unsheltered homelessness looks like in your community as well. I'm working with one community and they actually just like really don't have any shelter capacity. So they have, like you all like are experiencing this deep increase in unsheltered homelessness. But when we went out and talked to folks, a lot of folks said like, I would come inside if I had the option to. Like for them, it wasn't about like these barriers to shelter other than there just wasn't shelter. And so things like housing problem solving conversations, especially in the beginning, were going to make a big impact. But the point I want to drive here is that housing problem solving isn't just this diversion conversation. It can happen at any point of a relationship or housing journey with someone, but really understanding what safe alternatives people have, whether that's temporary or permanent. Even things like, you know, someone gets some money and they might stay in a motel for a few days, like that's an opportunity to rethink about like what does that mean for you to leave this motel and whatnot. It won't always lead to a shelter or housing option, but it keeps the conversation going. And like I said, kind of taking an opportunity when their situation does change to think about like what could look different for them, especially if they're like maybe even staying with a family member for a week, or they're going to a motel for a few days because they did get some money or whatever it may be. Let's move on, I think, Ellen, to maybe this one. Okay.
So another housing focused practice that street outreach can really support in a critical way is document readiness. I'm sure you're hearing from people all the time that it's hard to keep track of their belongings when they're staying in, you know, unsheltered situations. And that goes for some of the critical documents that folks need once they get a housing offer as well. So things like photo ID, social security card, birth certificates, proof of income, recent proof of income, right? A lot of housing providers want to see a date within the last 30 to 60 days. Verification of homelessness, letters of reference, any kind of documentation related to service animals, and any documentation related to mitigating potential tenant screening barriers, whether that's related to criminal history or credit or housing history. All of these documents are things that come into play when somebody gets that housing offer. And they're really hard to keep track of for any of us. I actually have no idea where my social security card is. I can't imagine how much harder it would be if I were trying to navigate, you know, a lot of other things without a safe place to stay at night. And so street outreach supporting document readiness can be really essential to prepare people for when that housing offer does come down the pike. So that might look like not only helping people navigate these different systems to get copies of these different items, but then also helping them figure out how to keep them. So, you're, working in the field all day, but is there any way that you could keep copies of some of the material on behalf of your clients to help make sure that they have access to them if they lose, what they're keeping on their person? Is there a way to get them connected with a safe place to keep their belongings while they're staying in an unsheltered situation? Sometimes day shelters will have like lockers or spaces that people can use to store stuff, or maybe they have other case managers in their lives that you could coordinate with to find safe places for them to keep their documents. It sounds simple, but it's something that often falls by the wayside when, again, you're triaging so many other needs. And it's something that really can act as a huge barrier to people getting into housing once that offer is made. Because again, sometimes housing providers have really tight timelines, or they're expecting folks to be able to walk in the next day with all of these things, and that's not always realistic. So is this something that folks are currently able to do to really help people with document readiness? And if not, are there things that you need or think you would benefit from in order to be able to do this in your current roles? Is it a barrier that you encounter? Maybe not. Are we losing steam? It's been an hour and 45 minutes, I know. It's okay if we are.
I know that we at Crossroads are implementing that as part of our process. And it hasn't been a hindrance for us.
It hasn't been. So your folks are hanging on to their documents for the most part, or you're able to get them pretty quickly?
We're able to get them pretty quickly, but we do offer keeping a copy and uploading it to HMIS.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's a great practice. Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome.
Okay. These are just some little things, but again, can make a huge difference in the housing process. So just some ways to overcome barriers that maybe we think of the traditional barriers of like the document readiness and also like criminal background checks and credit barriers, like all of those are, yes, absolute barriers to housing. But when we're thinking about like a street outreach person's role, sometimes it looks like helping them prepare for an apartment viewing and making sure they have access to a shower or whatnot. I know when I used to work with folks, I'd like meet up with them maybe like 3 hours before, and if they had been like actively using or there was alcohol in their breath or whatever it may be, fine, got them a coffee, shower, talked with them for a while. It just looks different for everyone, but making sure that they have someone to help them through that process. It can be so anxiety inducing to like go meet with this landlord who's going to have like a suit on or be at this big apartment complex and just kind of, throw off the kind of typical interactions that someone might have in a day. So just being that person that someone can lean on and trust and be there and help them feel prepared for that viewing can be really important. Place to keep belongings or pets safe during a viewing or interview. That could be through formal partnerships. It could be through the storage that you might have available to them. Transportation to housing related appointments. Sometimes that can help someone. If we go back to the coping mechanisms, like avoiding is definitely a coping mechanism, right? Keeping distance, isolating. And that can be particularly, that can come up when we're going through these hard kind of new situations. So just kind of being with someone to help them to get there at all. Support with mailing address, accessing mail, all of that can be incredibly important for getting through this housing process, and something that comes much harder for someone who doesn't have a consistent place to stay or a place to stay at all. Is that, what are the other like little kind of tips that you have for each other about how to overcome some of the housing barriers that come up, how to help people get to appointments and follow through on that, knowing everything that they're dealing with and these kind of coping mechanisms that they might be leaning on instead? Okay. That was our last one. Okay, I see some in the chat. Office hours. Oh, cool. It sounds like you all have a few spaces to connect with each other, and that's really great, even if it's just a space to learn more about what's happening in the community. So that's awesome to see. Oh,
I'm sorry. Crossroads started putting in like a table at the Providence Public Library for people who are coming in to, utilizing it as a warming cooling center. And also we're in collaboration with the city, Weber Renew and East Bay, using office space at Kennedy Plaza.
oh, cool. Thanks for sharing that, Peter. Any other resources or spaces that people want to share with each other? We have a few minutes, so feel free to share that. Okay. I mentioned this training before, and I appreciate all the responses that you gave to my impromptu question earlier, because that will certainly help us think more about the practices to highlight in this training. But we do have a practices for low barrier shelter training next Wednesday. It is going to be virtual from 10 to 12, so same time next week. And that's where we'll be digging into more of those like actual practices that shelters can have in place to create, to lower barriers for people to enter shelter. And yeah, so if you have any other questions or comments, Ellen and I will be on for a few more minutes. I'm going to be putting a survey link in the chat. It's just a feedback form, and it's really helpful for both Rhode Island Housing, who is like continuing this training series and definitely wants these trainings to be helpful for folks, but also for Ellen and I, because we do similar trainings for other communities or might be coming back in the future to do a training as part of this series. So if you could please take a moment to fill out that survey, it'd be super helpful. It's very low key. There's like a few questions. You don't have to answer all the questions. So I'm going to put that link in the chat right now, and it will also be sent out via email with the slides by Rosa after this training. We're also going to be sending out certificates of completion, and I should have everyone's email, I think. If you registered, if you didn't register, please go ahead and put your email in the chat or include it in your feedback survey. That would be really helpful. So if you didn't register, as in someone shared their link with you, we might not have your email. So just make sure it gets to us or Rosa, and we'll save the chat here. But really appreciate everyone's time. We know it's a lot to take 2 hours out of your day to sit virtually on a Zoom like this. And just appreciate you all being here and sharing resources with each other and all of that. So we'll stay on for a few minutes. Please take a minute to fill out that feedback form, and it was good to see you all.
Thank you. I also wanted to put, we have another training coming up. It's a more like a case management training to help individuals, working with unsheltered individuals and how to manage the mental health aspect of working with the client. So Yeah, thank you everybody for joining.